Hello, what is up, party people? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Jamila. This is JemilaBeReadin, because I do be reading, and we are finally talking about my top books of 2023. Now, I've talked frequently about how this hasn't been the best reading year for me, both in terms of quantity and quality. I just didn't read as much as I have in the last few years, which I'm not too concerned about. But what I am most concerned about is how just very mediocre this reading year has felt for me. I read a lot of books that fell somewhere in the 2 to 3 star range, so it kind of just left this very atmosphere in terms of my reading. But I did have some gems, and I am also talking about all of the books that I loved this year by genre, so like 4 stars and up, over on my TikTok if you want to go and check that out. Hear like shorter clips. But today I'm going to talk about my top 6 books of the year. Before I do that, I'll talk about some honorable mentions. These are going to be books that I gave 4.25 stars to 4.75 stars, so like the high 4-star range. And yeah, let's get into it. I first want to talk about 3 books that I reread this year. I'm not including them in my top books or honorable mentions, even though I did love these books, but they did kind of like solidify that I loved these books upon reread. So I just wanted to shout them out real quick. The first is What a Match by Mimi Grace, which is like my favorite romance book of all time, I think. It is like the perfect rom-com for me. It has such great fall vibes. The 2 leads have really great chemistry, and I just loved it so much. Next, I reread The 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin. The Broken Earth trilogy is one of my favorite series of all time, but I haven't read it in a very long time. I read this first book originally back in like December 2017, and then the other 2 books I read in early 2018. So it's been a while, and I wanted to reread them, and I had intentions of rereading the entire series this year, but I didn't end up getting around to it. But I did reread The 5th Season back in January. Loved it, of course. And I'm hoping I can continue on with my reread in 2024. And then I also reread Hench. Now, this is technically a 4-star read for me. Like on an actual like technical level, I think the pacing is weird, and there's some weird world building things that go on in here. But I have a 5-star love for this book, so that's why I just wanted to shout it out. I love these characters. I don't know. I love this world as well. And I'm hoping that we eventually get the second book in the series. Okay, let's move on to some honorable mentions. These are all books that I read for the first time this year. Like I said, I gave between a 4.25 and a 4.75 star. I have a little bit of a stack here, so I'm just gonna go quickly into it. So 2023 was the year that I started reading Viana Oniomo. She's like an indie romance author. I read Sweet Vengeance, and I also read Just for the Cameras, which I gave a 4 star, so I'm not going to mention too much here, but I did like that book also. But Sweet Vengeance is like, I guess, a monster romance. Joy, our main character, is wanting to get revenge on the man that SA'd her, and she ends up summoning a demon to help with this. They go on this revenge journey and end up falling in love in the process, and I just really love their relationship. It was very sweet. I love that he is not like an ancient immortal demon, but is like 30 years old, so I appreciated that, and it was just so good. Deep by River Solomon is a speculative novella that is following our protagonist, Yetu, who is a Wajiniru, which is like a siren or mermaid-like creature. They're descendants of pregnant African enslaved women who were thrown overboard by slave owners. And Yetu is like the memory holder of her people. And every year they have like a remembering ceremony where she kind of guides everyone through the memories of like their ancestors, and holding on to all of these memories by herself is like very traumatic. And one day she just kind of decides to run away. She goes to the surface, and we just kind of see what she experiences, and this was very good. Felix Ever After by Kaysen Calendar is following our titular Felix. He's a trans boy in high school. He's really into art, and he's been receiving some weird like transphobic comments online, and one day someone actually ends up releasing his dead name online, and so he wants to get revenge. He has an idea of who he thinks did this, and decides to kind of catfish this person. He ends up in a love triangle. It's a little bit messy. He makes some really, not great decisions, but I really enjoyed this. I liked Felix. A lot of this felt just like very reminiscent of high school to me, so I enjoyed it. Pet by Kweke Emezi is following our main character, Jam. She lives in this town called Lucille, where it's like almost like a utopian society. There are no more monsters, no more bad things going on, until one day a monster hunter comes out of her mother's painting and says that it's here to hunt a monster. And so Jam helps with this and kind of realizes that things are being like kind of swept under the rug, and that, you know, vigilance is necessary. There's never an end point on the journey to, I don't know, anti-racism, anti-homophobia, just all of those things. And it was so good. Kweke Emezi is one of my favorite authors, so of course I loved this. Next is Exit West by Mohsen Hamid, and this is following two people who end up kind of falling in love in the middle of a war. And then the second half of the book kind of uses speculative elements to discuss the immigrant journey experience. I really liked Mohsen Hamid's writing style, but I also felt like this book felt a little bit too disconnected for my personal taste. I kind of wanted to be in it a little bit more, but there's some very beautiful lines in this, and I am interested in checking out more from this author. Honey and Spice by Bolu Babalola is a romance book. I finally got around to reading this. I feel like everyone has like loved and read this book. It's following Kiki, who has a radio show on her college campus. She needs to increase her ratings because she wants to get this scholarship, and the way to do that is to partner up with Malachi, the new kid at this university, and they end up fake dating so that she can have a new show or a new segment on her show to increase ratings. And obviously they fall in love. It's just so much fun. I really love this. They had great chemistry, really good banter. It's a good time. With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo is a YA contemporary following Amani, who is a teen mom. She's in her final year of high school, and we're just kind of following her life. She has such a passion and love and skill for cooking, and that's really prevalent throughout this book. She ends up getting to join this culinary elective, and that kind of takes her on this journey of like considering becoming a chef and just kind of imagining her future, because so much of it is focused on, you know, taking care of her daughter and working and all that stuff. And so it was so good. I highly recommend the audiobook as well for this. Only for the Week by Natasha Bishop is following Janelle, who is going to this, I think, Caribbean island for her sister's wedding, and her sister is getting married to her ex, and everyone is kind of walking on eggshells, but she's over it. She doesn't really care, but she has like a not great relationship with her sister and her mother as well. And she ends up getting into a little situationship with her ex's best friend, Rome, who's also the best man. And they had such great chemistry. I'm not someone that really cares about like book boyfriends or something like that, but if there was anyone that I would be like book boyfriend material, it's Rome. He rents out a yacht for her to have quiet time and reading time, and he also gets into like the romance series that she's into, and they talk about it. It's just so good. They have a really great chemistry. The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin. I'm sad to say that this isn't in my top books of the year. I thought it may have been, but this ended up being not as good as The City We Became, which was a 5-star read for me. This is the conclusion to the Great Cities duology. I can't really say much here, except that it's good, just not as good as I thought the first book was. But there was a fight scene at the end of this book that was so interesting and so unique, and it was like almost entirely conceptual. It was a good time to read. We Deserve Monuments by Jazz Hammonds is a YA contemporary following Avery, who's going back to her mother's small town because her maternal grandmother is very ill and is dying. Be with her in like the last parts of her life, and she's also trying to figure out why her mother and grandmother don't have a great relationship, what kind of drove her mother away, and just kind of like figure out all of the family secrets while also trying to get to know her grandmother during this time. And she also like falls in love with this other girl, a neighbor, and it's just so good. I really, really enjoyed this. I feel like I'm someone that really loves like kind of family saga stories, and the two books that I thought were going to be like all-time favorites were disappointing, and I was surprised that a YA book that was doing that ended up being like among my favorites of the year. So highly recommend. Next is Butter Honey Pig Bread by Francesca Ekwasi. This is a like contemporary novel that's really just vibes, you know, not much plot, but we are following three main perspectives. We're following three different perspectives: Kambiranachi and her two twin daughters, Kende and Taye. And Kambiranachi believes herself to be an Obanji, which is a spirit that plagues a family with grief by dying repeatedly in childhood and being reborn. And Kambiranachi kind of like fears, she makes the decision to stay in this body and grow up and have a life, and she fears that like there might be consequences for that. And we're just kind of following their lives. It, like I said, it's a very like no plot, just vibes, character driven story we're watching throughout, but I just found it so interesting and it's so beautifully written. This is a debut, which is just incredibly impressive, and I'm excited to read whatever this author writes next. And finally, for my honorable mentions is Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. This is following Sonia, a British Palestinian actress who ends up going to Palestine to visit her sister and kind of gets roped into being a part of an Arabic-speaking version of Hamlet. And so we're watching as she gets to know all of these different people and get exposed to the realities of Palestinians. Not that she wasn't aware of that, but she did live kind of a sheltered life. And she did visit during the summers of her childhood, but she kind of remained, you know, in a very like, you know, sheltered life. So I think what was super interesting is how we got to see so many different aspects of Palestinian life. Like we were jumping around from like the West Bank to also seeing people who were like Palestinian citizens of Israel, and just like watching all of these different experiences, which I thought was really interesting. And it was also very beautifully written. I have a lot of tabs here, so yeah, if you're a Shakespeare girly, I highly recommend checking this one out. Okay, it's time to finally talk about my top 6 books of the year. These are all 5-star reads, books that I loved, and I'm just gonna go in chronological order, not in any like particular order here. First is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. This is following 15-year-old Lauren, who has like hyper empathy ability. She can like really feel what other people are feeling, and we are kind of like in this dystopian world, very, I think, pretty reminiscent to our world. Like this was written in the 90s and it's set in like 2025, which was kind of like partially like 2023 through 2025. So it was kind of a trip to read, honestly. And she knew some things, you know. But we're following Lauren. She grew up in like this gated community that was like closed off from the rest of the world, but then she ends up leaving after it gets attacked and like gathering up people. She kind of ends up creating her own cult, like religious cult, if you will. And we're just kind of watching this journey as they try to find land to make a new home for themselves, and she's kind of like developing this religion a little bit more as we go. And it's just like such a fascinating read, and it's just so interesting to see like how much Octavia Butler was able to predict about the state of our world, like almost 40 years ago. And I think it just goes to show how dystopian books are just so much like more well written by marginalized people, just because we're living that reality every day. Marginalized people are much more on the pulse of like our society and where our society is headed. So it's really good. It's a very harrowing read, but well worth it. Now, Parable of the Sower was my only 5-star read for like a solid 4 or 5 months. I read this in like February, and I didn't get my next 5-star read until towards the end of June. And that was She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan, which is a historical fantasy. I'd say it's like pretty light on the fantasy elements, but there's some still there, and I think it's still worth the read. It's really good. We're following Zhu Chengba, who is like orphaned and ends up assuming their brother's name and identity in order to try to possess their brother's destiny, because it was predicted that their brother was going to be like super successful and powerful. And so their brother dies. They end up assuming his identity for their own safety and also to try to achieve greatness of their own. And we watch as they go to a monastery and then end up joining a rebellion group and then kind of end up leading a rebellion group. And it's just so good. Like, I mentioned this like multiple times. If there was ever a book written for me personally, it's this book. It was just everything that I could ever want in a historical fantasy. And we're following multiple perspectives as well, not just from Zhu. We're also following another character who is a eunuch and also a part of like the main like empire, like a fighter, like a high-ranking soldier. And they kind of have like such interesting parallel journeys, and it's just so good. And I'm going to be reading He Who Drowned the World soon. It's just fantastic. Then we have Minor Detail, which I think is only like about 60 pages. It's like 100 pages in this copy, but I think it's a little bit shorter in the original printing of it. And I listened to the audiobook, which I highly recommend. And I guess you could say that this is like literary or historical fiction, but I honestly think that the way that this was written feels like it could be horror. And not just because like the things that happen in this book are horrific, but I think just the way that it's written and the use of repetition that Adania Shibli employs throughout this, especially when it comes to the senses, the things that people are hearing, the sensations on their skin, the smell, and just like all of that repetition, the way that it's utilized, it just like amps up the tension and this kind of fear and unsettlingness that you feel throughout this. So the first half of this book is following an Israeli soldier shortly after the Nakba, and they're trying to root out the last of the Arabs in the Negev desert. This soldier and other soldiers end up finding this young girl and assaulting her. And what I appreciated is how this book was able to show the like horrificness of that without being very explicit about it. And it's not like super like explicit on the page. The second half of this book is following a woman who ends up kind of figuring out, like discovering this history about this girl who was assaulted by these Israeli soldiers and wants to learn more about this situation and about this girl's life. And so she ends up going into, like sneaking, I guess, into the Israel part of Palestine, and just is so determined to learn more about this like minor detail in this long history of ethnic cleansing and atrocities against Palestinians. And like I said, the use of repetition, it's just, I feel like it just really got stuck in my mind, and it just, the way that it was written, it just like really built up this tension all the way to the end of this book. And you could tell, like, you know, like how this is going to end, but like despite that fact, you're just like hoping that it doesn't end that way. And I just think that this was so fantastically written. The way that this author was able to do all of that in such a short amount of time. Like, I understand why she was being honored, and I also understand why they were trying to take that honor away from her, because this was so well written and really shows the horrificness. So highly recommend. Then I read Against the Loveless World by Susan Abulhawa, and this was so good. This book was so good. We're following Nahar, and we are in multiple timelines. So the first timeline is present-ish day. Nahar is in solitary confinement in an Israeli prison, and the second timeline is her kind of like recounting her life up until the point where she goes into this prison. And we're following her from like around teenage years all the way up to the present day. And we're just kind of following her life throughout multiple different countries: Kuwait, Jordan, Palestine, dealing with displacement, dealing with being in the diaspora, a refugee, and also returning back to Palestine and kind of getting involved in the resistance movement. And I just think that this book was so compellingly written. It almost felt like a page turner to me. Like, I couldn't stop thinking about this book. All I wanted to do was read more. And even though it's not like the type of book that you would think would be a page turner, it was. I think Nahar was such a compelling character. She was so interesting. And I think what Susan Abdul Hawa does really well is writing really interesting and complicated relationships. I think the most interesting one was between her and the woman who kind of, I guess, tricks her into sex work. And it's just so interesting because obviously this lady did a terrible thing to her, and yet they have such a close friendship. It was just so interesting to read, and highly recommend. Next is To Shape a Dragon's Breath by Monoquil Blackgoose. This is following an indigenous girl named Anakus who lives on this island, and one day she finds a dragon egg, and the dragon egg hatches and bonds with Anakus, and she ends up becoming its rider and companion. But her island and like the surrounding islands and land has been colonized by the English, which I think is actually supposed to be Dutch people, but I think it just could really be like insert European colonizing country here situation. They have like a very specific understanding of how dragons should be raised. So she ends up kind of being forced by circumstances to enroll into this English dragon college or academy, and has to go leave her island that she's known for her whole life and gets kind of thrust into this world of manners and societies. And she is one of 2 indigenous people at this school. And yeah, we're just kind of watching her navigate all of this. This is another one I would say is kind of not historical fantasy, but like kind of. It's not super heavy on the fantasy or even the like intense dragonness, at least not in this first book. But it was just so good, and it was so interesting to see her navigate this new world. And what I loved the most was that she was so steadfast in her culture and her beliefs. Because I feel like I said this in my November wrap up, I think is when I was first talking about this book. In a lot of these kinds of stories where you have fish out of water, but specifically like entering the like oppressor's world, they end up, I feel like there's always like a situation where they want to try to fit in, or they're feeling like kind of bad about themselves and their culture. And then at the end they come back and they're like, no, actually, like, you know. But we don't have that with Anakus. She is always constantly so steadfast in herself, and she is like, you guys are the weirdos. You guys are the ones who are wrong, not me or my people. And I just loved that so much. She is such a great character. Honestly, if I had to choose like a favorite protagonist of these top reads, it would have to be Anakus. She's just so kind and clever and a little bit hot-headed, but not in a stupid way, you know. I just love this book so much, and I'm so excited for the follow-up. And finally, a more recent read for me is Chang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This is a dystopian book that is focused on talking about the prison industrial complex in the United States. And in this futuristic world, we have this sport, I guess it's like gladiator style sport where imprisoned people can choose to join this show or this fighting thing, and if they win enough fights, they have the chance to win their freedom. And it's like a fight to the death style, so someone is always dying, and they have like chains, so there's like kind of groupings like of people who kind of like form a team. And we're following mainly 2 people, Hurricane Stacks and Loretta Thurwall, who are 2 of the like best fighters currently who've lasted. And Loretta is actually on the cusp of freedom. She's been in this like circuit for like 3 years. She just has a few more fights to win before she's free. And I should also mention that these fights are televised. It's almost kind of like the Hunger Games a little bit. These fights are televised, and we're following these two. They're also in a relationship with each other. We're following these two, but we're also following multiple perspectives of people. Some are fans of the show, like viewers. Some are like the people in charge of the show. We're following other contestants. And we're also following people who are protesting against this and calling for it to be abolished, and how it's really like disgusting, you know? So it's just it was so good. I highly recommend the audiobook. It has multiple narrators, and it's just such a good audiobook, honestly. But I'm thinking a lot about the reasons people don't like this book, which I honestly don't understand personally. I like that it's multiple POVs. I think we get just enough of Loretta and Stax to understand these characters, to understand their relationships to each other. And I think all of the little like perspectives that we get really add to this story about like the prison industrial complex. I think including POVs from people watching this and like fans of it, the people who are protesting, I think it just all comes together to make a really good book and to really get the point across. And I personally don't think it's super heavy-handed. Or rather, I should say it's heavy-handed, but handled with care and with nuance. Like, it's not in your face without more. Does that make sense? Like, it's very clear in the message that it's trying to give, but I think it does it in a very nuanced way. And I just, was at the edge of my seat for a lot of this, like wondering where the hell this was gonna go. And the ending, I just kind of sat there and stared at the wall, It was a lot. It's a heavy read for sure, but it's very good and I think very worth the read. And I'm excited to check out this author's short story collection called Friday Black. I have the ebook. I've had it for a while, but this was fantastic and I highly, highly recommend the audiobook. But that is all for my top books of 2023. I'd love to know if you've read any of these books that I've mentioned, your thoughts on any of these books. Let me know what your favorites of 2023 are. And Happy New Year, because I am posting this hopefully on New Year's Day. So I hope y'all have a great 2024 and a great reading year. I hope I also have a great reading year. I need it. But I'll check y'all in the next video.